Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Ellen Wald, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center and also president of Transversal Consulting. Ellen, great to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be back.
Well, it's good to have you. Let's start by just getting your opinion on, sentiment at the moment on the regional geopolitical situation here in the Middle East, where I am, just from the sense of how nervous, the energy markets, global energy markets might be at the moment because obviously of the escalating tensions and, possible imminent strike on Iran from Israel and possible energy facilities being hit, although people are discounting that's going to happen. How nervous is the energy market about this?
For quite a long time, and we still are, analysts especially are kind of trapped in older paradigms of what tensions and escalation in the Middle East actually mean for the oil market. And we've actually seen the oil market undergo a lot of changes since these old paradigms came into place. I mean, we're talking about paradigms from the 1970s that have persisted for many, many years, but have really, I think, now don't necessarily apply. And so we're seeing prices rise for threats that aren't really realistic anymore. And so I do wish that people would kind of unpack these threats instead of this blanket, oh, tensions are rising in the Middle East, that could affect the oil supply. Oil might not be able to get out of the Persian Gulf, so prices go up. Well, that doesn't necessarily apply the same way it did in the 70s or the 80s or 90s or even early 2000s. We're really in a very different place with different motivations, different supplies, different patterns even of transportation. And so I think that we actually need to recognize that there are a different set of threats as opposed to say, is oil going to get out of the Persian Gulf?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I suppose the last 6 months in particular, even discounting the escalation of the last 2, 3 weeks, but oil has continued to flow, hasn't it, through the Gulf, and even the Red Sea disruptions that we saw earlier this year, were minimal in the grander scheme of things. But of course, one thing that has saved the market, I suppose, and I suppose kept the oil price tempered is demand, isn't it? Because, and you mentioned China as well. Let's talk about that then. Because
Yeah,
also but there has been a bit of a down, I suppose, disappointment in how strong demand has been this year, hasn't there? And that's helped obviously the situation.
Absolutely. And I think that if we were in a situation where we were seeing, huge growth in demand from China right now, that prices would be in a different place. But of course, at the same time, we've also got a huge amount of production coming out of the United States. And so that really does help temper the potential issues in the Middle East. But I do think that the primary issue to remember right now is that the main customer of oil from the Persian Gulf is not the United States and Europe right now. It's really China and Asia. And even if demand in China isn't growing, even if we're not seeing massive jumps in economic growth, China is still a very, very, very large consumer of oil. And so there's a huge amount of pressure, I think, on Iran in particular, but other countries in the Middle East from China to ensure that the flow of oil to Asia from the Persian Gulf remains undisrupted. And I think Iran recognizes this very, very, very well. They recognize that China is their main customer and they need that oil. And in fact, I think the shift, over the past 4 years, we've seen Iran's oil exports grow. And it has supported their economy, and they recognize that this is necessary for them. And so if they took any steps to even threaten the flow of other oil in or out of the Persian Gulf, their own exports would be threatened. China doesn't want that, and they need their oil. So China doesn't want to see its supplies from Iran disrupted. They don't want to see their supplies from Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Kuwait or any of the other countries there disrupted. And China China's a different animal from the United States. It used to be the U.S. was the biggest consumer of oil from the Gulf. That's not the case anymore.
Yeah.
China acts differently. China is heavily involved in Iran. Both it's a huge consumer, but it's also sending large amounts of Chinese products to these countries, especially Iran, because Iran can't just trade with anybody in terms of the sanctions. So China is a huge trading partner for them. And I think that that's a really important factor to remember when we're thinking about, is there really a potential for Iran to disrupt the flow of oil? And the answer is, as long as Iranian oil is going to China, the answer is no.
I'd like to touch on sort of OPEC Plus and Saudi and what the policy for that is going forward. But non-OPEC also supply has been consistent this year. It hasn't necessarily spiked in any way, but again, it's growing still at a regular pace. And yet, countries like Saudi Arabia that are leading the OPEC Plus group intend to start putting volumes back onto the market, despite the fact that we've had weak prices. I mean, do you believe, first of all, that this is going to happen? Has Saudi Arabia said, I'm fed up with taking the brunt of these cuts, and it's time to get a bit of our market share back?
So I do think that there is immense pressure to start to unwind these cuts that have been going on for a long time. They were supposed to start to unwind in October. And I think to OPEC's credit, they really put forward a very clear schedule for how this is going to happen. The increases are supposed to be quite small, but so this is a very gradual process. They don't want to shake the market, and they put this out well ahead of time to give people time to prepare. And then September comes around, and the pressure on them to just postpone this was huge. And so we did see a postponement, which I think, given their goals, given what was happening in China at the time, was probably the right move. At least it's a move that I expected them to take. But, there's going to come a point where you got to just rip off the Band-Aid and let it happen. Let it
Even if
rip.
that means, prices dropping another $10, $15.
Well, it's unclear if they would really drop another $10 to $15, because even though China is showing some, stagnation in terms of growth, it's not entirely clear how the recent stimulus packages are going to impact that, where China is going to be going. But also, there's still a huge world out there that needs a lot of oil. And with the amount of oil that they're planning to put back, it's going to be a very gradual process. Now, I think that it's very much complicated by this kind of secondary shadow oil market that we've got, which is mostly Russian oil and Iranian oil and some Venezuelan oil. And so, if you could actually, if all the oil that was sanctioned was not actually on the market, we would have much higher prices.
You've got obviously those who've taken those voluntary cuts, but you've got the other question of compliance, with the quotas. And of course, I mean, it's no secret that Iraq has been overproducing, Kazakhstan, some people even say the UAE has gone beyond its quota. Again, and the subject of new quotas was going to be on the table at the end of the year, if not before. Do you think that compliance is going to come a bit under control, with Saudi sort of, I suppose, using the stick of, I'm going to put oil back onto the market? I mean, or do those producers are just going to continue as usual?
I do think that there is there has to be some degree of acceptance of Iraq is never they're never going to totally comply. Some people, some countries, you're never really going to get. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to push better compliance, even if you're never going to get, where it should be. So I do think that Saudi Arabia does have this one trump card in its pocket, which is overproduction, because it alone of all other countries is capable of putting a massive amount of oil on the market in a very short amount of time. And they can cause prices to bottom out. And if you're trying to get your producers in line, that's where you want to play it. Now, the problem is that if you play that card too many times, then they're going to call your bluff, and it doesn't work.
They do also have obviously big, ambitious economic plans, don't they? And they've budgeted for those. And they've even, obviously had to rebudget some of them this in the past year or so as oil prices, disappointed a little bit. But what about that? What is the bottom line for the economic sort of budget planning for Saudi, do you think? What, realistically speaking, where do you think they'd stop at to protect? What is the new floor for Saudi Arabia today in terms of an ideal oil price? Not ideal, but the one which it would not go below and would do anything to protect.
So, so I think that they would be, I wouldn't be surprised to see them willing to plunge prices to say 40 if they felt like it would pay off and it would be, I don't want to say temporary, but it would be short-lived. Because Saudi, like I said, Saudi Arabia can afford it. And if you have, one of the things you have to remember is that it's not like the oil money goes directly into the Saudi coffers. Aramco sells the oil. Okay, they collect, they make the money, and then they pay taxes and dividends and all sorts of other stuff to the Saudi government, and that's how the government makes their money. So yes, there is this idea of, okay, there's a price that the Saudis need to, break even in terms of their budget. But that's not the only way that they can make money. First of all, the government has had great success with, with bonds. So they've taken out a lot of debt, and Aramco takes debt too now. They didn't used to, but they do now, and it's been a very it's not bad to have debt. Lots of countries have debt. It's not a bad thing. It's actually, I think, a very wise thing, and it shows economic maturity in the country.
And what would a $50 oil price do for American production, US production?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question because the oil market, the oil industry right now in the U.S. is not the same as it was in 2015, 2016, 2017. Not the same market at all. At that time, we were seeing what we saw was it was really actually quite fascinating because you had lots and lots of smallish oil companies all in these shale oil producing regions, and they were producing and producing and producing. And they had to, just to make payroll, even if the price they were selling their barrels for didn't even break even for production. Never mind their company budget, but just the cost to produce a well. But they had to just keep producing and keep drilling and keep doing it just to keep, the cash coming in so that they could continue to function as a company. That is not the case anymore. That situation, once prices plunged during the pandemic shutdowns, that situation was taken care of. All of those companies are either out of business or were, bought by other companies.
M&A. Yeah.
That's not a situation that we're in right now. These companies, there's been a huge amount of consolidation. Companies cut a lot of excess. And this is a normal cycle in the U.S. oil industry. It happens all the time. It's the boom and bust cycle. There's some really great books written about it. We're still, this is how it is. It hasn't really changed that much. But right now we're in this cycle where there's been a lot of consolidation. There's a lot more intelligence being used to drill these wells. So each well is much more productive than it was. It used to be that everyone wanted to know what was the rig count for the week? What was the frac count? Because that would give you a sense of how much oil was going to be produced in the future. That information is not nearly as valuable anymore because each well is much more productive, and companies are deploying all sorts of new technologies and new ways of looking at things to get more oil out of each well because it's become very expensive to drill wells. You've seen a lot of inflation, a lot of the supply chain issues caused this, and it forced companies to really, be much more productive with what they had. And so I think that we're not going to see nearly as many ups and downs in terms of U.S. production. It is very high right now. That's true. We're at record levels.
Is it at 13? Is it at 13
yeah,
still?
We're a little over 13 right now. I think that we're likely to be fairly stable. It could move up a little bit, but we're not going to see massive jumps. But likewise, I don't think we're going to see a huge drop.
What difference would it make to energy policy going forward? I mean, as you said, we've had regulations that are in the pipeline, but then we have obviously the transition policies. We've got the IRA Act. Will there be any real difference if we have a Trump or Harris presidency in that regard?
I do think there will be a difference. I think the most important thing that for businesses in America, and that includes the oil industry, is consistency. And it's really important for them to know what to expect. And the Biden presidency has had a lot of unexpected things. So, for example, the ban on new LNG, well, I don't want to say a ban, but it was the decision to
Pause.
halt all new permitting
Yeah.
for new LNG terminals. That came out of nowhere for a lot of people. And that is an element of uncertainty that is not good for business, especially not in the oil industry. And so I think that there's generally a sense of we know what to expect from a Trump administration. There was one before, and we know to expect that there aren't going to be surprise hurdles placed on certain legitimate businesses. Whereas, yes, we've had a Biden administration for the past 4 years, but there is more of a sense of growing uncertainty if there's a Harris administration. I think there's an expectation that the Harris administration would continue with a lot of the Biden policies, but that those policies were very unpredictable.
We touched on Russia a bit, but I wanted just to get your take on that in terms of its oil flowing to Asia, discounted. I mean, you mentioned it earlier. We saw earlier this year bigger volumes going to India, for example. China has had its own dynamics. Do you expect more of the same as we go into next year? Nothing seems to be stopping the Russians from selling their oil. And what impact do you think that has on the Gulf producers' thinking in terms of Asia being their core market?
That's exactly. I mean, I think that that's a big concern. I think that the Gulf producers definitely are keeping their eye on, what Russia is selling to Asia, because there are a lot of big customers there. I do think that, like, when it comes to, say, Aramco and it comes to the UAE, to ADNOC, there's a real strategy undergoing to shift towards more downstream as opposed to just upstream sales. And that can that's, I think, a positive for their strategy in terms of Asia, because they've got joint ventures there, so they've got kind of certain sales locked in, but they can also make up money selling products as opposed to just straight oil. Russia doesn't have that ability so much. I don't think there's no sign that there's going to be any kind of, I don't want to say crackdown, but tightening of the sanctions policies by the West on Russia. I think, I think the people who put the policies in place believe that they are working. For what end? I'm not entirely sure that their goals are what they want them to be. There's a sense of we're going to restrict Russia's ability to get revenue from its energy industry, and that is somehow going to translate to wins on the battlefield. I think that is not happening. And they want to keep the oil on the market because they don't want prices to spike.
Ellen Wald, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council for Global Energy Center. Thank you so much for joining us today on Halftime Talk.
Thank you for having me.